Before I did my recent trip to Alaska, I made several modifications to my RV. And in this video, I'm going to be discussing the things that worked, the things that didn't work, and some things that I've done since I got back from Alaska. Hi. Earlier this year, I showed the preparations that I was doing in my RV. It's the Travato 59K, but I was showing the preparations that I was doing to get ready for a trip up to Alaska. Well, I've returned to Alaska, and I just wanted to discuss the things that worked, the things that didn't work. And also, I'm in the process of doing a few minor upgrades, maybe one major upgrade, I'm not sure yet. But anyway, I just thought I would discuss what worked, what didn't work, and what I wish I had done instead. As you may remember, I put a second panel, a 100-watt panel, a solar panel, on the roof. And I put it on a tilt mount. Now, the reason I put it on a tilt mount was with the idea that, okay, if I go really far north, then the sun's going to be lower in the sky. So, by putting it on a tilt mount, I would be able to get better solar rays. Well, that resulted in a disaster. The disaster is that whenever I was coming down from Tok, Alaska to Valdez, actually between Tok and Glen Allen, the air got caught under the tilt mount because it was raised up a little higher than the other solar panel. Also, the kit that I used wing nuts as opposed to self-locking nuts to hold it in place. And of course the reason is that with wing nuts and on the tilt mount, you're going to have to unscrew the nuts to raise it up and lower it. Well, we had a really windy day one day, and the wind got under the raised tilt mounts and caused it to caused the front side of it to break loose. Actually, I did find one of the wing nuts when I got back. It actually had laid on top of the rig. I don't know how it laid on there for that long, but it was still there. So, but anyway, it caused it to break loose, and the whole thing got caught in the wind and flipped over. Now, when it flipped over, it hit the ladder, and when it hit the ladder, it caused the whole thing to shatter. So I lost the solar panel that was on the tilt mount, which means that I had only one 100-watt solar panel, and that caused some extra stress because that meant that I had to rely more on the generator to recharge my batteries. Now, I was able to do that, but I regretted losing that extra solar panel. Now, truth be told, there's absolutely no reason to use a tilt mount when you go to Alaska for two reasons. First of all, the sun does not go from one end of the sky to the other end of the sky, but it sort of goes in an arc. You're just up so high that the sun goes in an arc. So if you're boondocking in a stationary location and you want to be able to take advantage of the tilt mount, then you've got to constantly move your rig. And the other thing is that the sun stays up a long time. The sky easily is lighted until midnight, or even further than that if you get up there early enough. So therefore, even though you're at even though it's flat and you're not perpendicular to the sun, you've got more hours of sun. So therefore, you do overcome the fact that it's at a higher altitude. So if I were doing it again, I would not use a tilt mount, and I would make sure that I was using self-locking nuts as opposed to those butterfly nuts. Now I have put the second solar panel on. I did get a new one, and it's working just fine. The key thing though is that now it's just on a regular mount with self-locking nuts. It's pretty secure, but I do now have 200 watts of solar, which is good, and they're both functional. An additional thing that I did was to replace all of the USB plugs in my rig with cigarette lighter plugs. I reasoned that I could always plug one of these things into the cigarette lighter to get the USB connections. The only problem is that if this did not make a good connection with the circuit, then the plug would not work. Now I did need some cigarette lighter plugs because I have some things that do require cigarette lighter plugs. But I replaced all of them, and that required me to get a whole bunch of these. So I'm now in the process of removing some of the cigarette lighter plugs and putting the USB plugs back in. And that should eliminate the problem of these plugs, USB plugs, not making a good connection. We'll see. One thing that worked really well was my spare tire. This is the Wilco tire. It moves away, leaves the door open and all that stuff. It worked really quite well. Fortunately, I never had to mount the tire, but it was such a great feeling to know that I had the spare. The van did not come with very much insulation, so it could get cold. I added a lot of insulation before I left, and it made it comfortable even when I was in sub-freezing weather. But I recently made some modifications to my insulation by adding a moisture barrier, so I will discuss that later. The panel on my refrigerator kept popping off, and that's irritating. I tried using some mounting tape to stick it in place before I left. The tape that I'm going to be using, it's Scotch tape, and it's just it's Scotch mounting tape, and so that means it's got sticky stuff on both sides. It's pretty strong. You can see where I've mounted the tape, and I used one of my cutters to start peeling the back side of the tape off. So this side is sticky, the other side is sticky as well. So we'll see if this will work. Now we'll just put this back on and see if it'll hold. You may remember that I was complaining about the cover constantly popping off. And I'd be driving down the road and this thing would literally pop out and I was having to put it back. So I put felt, well not felt, but I put two-sided sticky tape, strong sticky tape back behind this and held it in place. That didn't work so well. It worked for a while, but eventually it popped out again. So what I did instead was to rely on Gorilla Glue. So I took this off and I poured Gorilla Glue all over the back side of this and pushed it back in. And that held great. It was absolutely fantastic. So I had that was great. There was no problem at all. So that was sort of a miss, But the substitute of putting in Gorilla Glue, I wish I could pronounce it correctly, Gorilla Glue on the back side of this and pushing it into place held beautifully. And it hasn't popped off since. It hadn't warped or anything like that. It's just sticking there just fine. So that's a sort of a halfway positive, not totally positive. If you remember, I put some felt on the table to prevent it from rattling while I was driving. That worked great. I had very few rattles, with the exception of when I was in the far north on very, very rough roads and was driving really hard. Now, of course, in Alaska, I did a lot of driving on gravel roads, and some were pretty rocky, some were pretty rough. So yeah, I had a few bounces and stuff like this, but for the most part, it was relatively quiet. So this worked great. Putting in the felt liners that I did on each of the sides worked fantastically. Well, that just about completes the evaluation of the things that worked and the things that didn't work in my preparation for my trip to Alaska. The key to going to Alaska is to be flexible. You've got to take your tools. Yeah, some things will happen, but most of the things are things that you can fix yourself, so you don't really need to worry too much about it. In my next video, I'm going to be talking about some of the changes that I've made fairly recently. For instance, I've added a moisture barrier to my insulation, and I've added an extra drawer, under cabinet drawer for my silverware. So I'll be talking about those things and showing you videos of those modifications in my next video. Until then, take care.